Hello and welcome to our special episode of Yerden Yüksek. Today our guest is Brett Wilson. Brett Wilson is a scholar of Turkish history and Islamic history, and mainly Turkish audience knows about Brett Wilson from his famous book about Quran Kerim translations in the age of nationalism. This book, most of our audience will know about him from his early work, but he continued his work at the Central European University in Vienna, and in the last couple of weeks he published his last article about a critical transformation of Turkish religious institutions through the period of secularization in the early Republican history. He wrote something very serious about the lineage and the profession's privilege and persecutions about the Sufi leaders in early Turkish Republic. And his article attracts a lot of audience in Turkish public, and we will need his expertise and his understandings about what really happened in the early Turkish history on the case of religious Sufi leaders, what his inner knowledge. And because to me we know basic things about early Turkish history, we know certain facts that we in Turkey had a period of forced steadfast secularization period, but we didn't really pinpoint what really happened to the specific people and specific institutions. So that we need Brett's understandings and Brett's research to really find out what really happened. We have a lot of prejudices, we have a lot of political agendas, we have a lot of ideas about that part of history, but we really know that history? I'm not pretty sure about it. So in that regard, we really need the help of historians to clarify what really happened at that time. So thank you, Brett. Welcome.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, Ilkan. And I'm glad to have this opportunity to discuss the article. Shocked by the huge response to it in the first place. And I think this is a much better place to discuss it than on X or any other social media site, because many of the conversations, as you said, started to go very quickly in certain directions, which maybe I didn't intend. So I'm very happy to discuss with you today.
So, when you examine that part of our history, you had some knowledge before that you start to examine that part of history. But when you start to focus on that area, what really did you have any surprises? Did you change your mind? Any paradigm shifts or whatever?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, for me, the only reason to do historical research is to be surprised, right? Oftentimes, we have the idea that things were a certain way, and then we go back and we look at the archives or look at the memoirs, and we see that actually they were very different. And today's categories, today's political views, today's histories might not make sense at all once we look at those sources. And so, yes, as you said, I had a background with this subject. I'm not sure as many people read that book as you think, Ilkan, but I'm thankful to those who did. But in any case, I spent, about 10 years researching and writing about the idea of creating Turkish Islam through translating the Quran, and also those different reforms that were connected to that. So the language reform, Turkish worship, Türkçe de ibadet, these type of topics. So the period I'm very familiar with, and I really think it's very important to continue looking at it, because still the early Republican reforms are often quite misunderstood. And I think there are good reasons for that, because, of course, the way that history has been written, not only in Turkey, but everywhere, where you're building a new nation, official history tends to make the facts go in the direction of the political agenda. And this is the field of history over time, and especially for new or revolutionary nation states. So you might be wondering, why did I decide to look at the 1925 law about abolishing Sufism and the lives of Sufi sheikhs after that? Well, for one thing, it's one of the least understood reforms of the early Republic. I think that if you read the major history books on the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, the early Republican era, very few people deal with any details relating to that reform. They basically mention it in a list of other things like the hat law or the alphabet reform, and then they move on, right? We don't have many details. People often cite only speeches by Ataturk or only some, parliamentary debates quickly. Then you'll hear something about various revolts, Sheikh Said, Menemen, story's over, right? Move on. And of course, this is a very, very limited scope when looking at this reform, because if we think about it, Sufi lodges, Sufi sheikhs, turbes, mausoleums, this constituted a pillar of Islam in the Ottoman Empire. Let's say maybe there's three pillars. There's the madrasas, there's the mosques, and the Sufi lodges. And we're talking about something like between 800 and 1,000 Sufi lodges, and even more turbes, like something like between 1,000 and 1,500. So when you close down this many institutions, we're talking about thousands and thousands of people who are affected. Either their job ends, or they have to change their lifestyle, they have to move sometimes, they have to find a new line of work. So this is a really big story about thousands of people. And what I've done here is really the beginning. It's really the tip of an iceberg of a much bigger story, which we're trying to investigate. But I think it's an important beginning because, of course, the sheikhs, the babas, the post-nishinler falan, these people all have important social and religious and political roles in their communities. They're oftentimes not just a sheikh, they're often also a local leader. They're, maybe a major landholder. They're someone with, a lot of education. In many contexts, they were the most educated people in their environment. And so the story of these people is really essential to understanding what happened after 1925. Now, I said earlier that it's a very hard reform to understand. And I think I stand behind that. And there's several reasons for it. The first is that, as we mentioned, the history of the period is very limited, and it's told in such a way that there's, either the Turkish state crushed the sheikhs, it eliminated the Tekkes and Zaviyes, and it kind of, that was it. This is maybe the official state history, which declares it to be a successful reform that, reformed Islam in Turkey. Then, maybe on the other side, you have a revisionist history, a history which says, yes, the state did that, and that was a really bad thing. That was persecution. That was the oppression of a large segment of the Turkish, say, religious class. This was made popular in the 1950s, especially by Necip Fazıl Kısakürek. And it's been a theme that we hear until today, right? It's kind of repeated. So what you actually have is the official history on the one hand, and the revisionist history agreeing on the facts. They agree there was a massive persecution. They just disagree on whether or not it was a good idea or not, whether it was progress or whether it was injustice. And as I look at the archival documents and the lives of these people, I just don't see that. I see something different. I see a much more complicated story and a much more interesting story, actually, right? I mean, one more second and I'll stop. But the other, I think, very confusing thing about this reform is that if we look today in Turkey, or say even the past 30, 40 years, we see that Sufi sheikhs and tarikats are quite visible and quite accepted. I mean, virtually every Sufi sheikh in Turkey has a Twitter or X account. You can see what they say about any topic. They have websites. You can go on YouTube and see videos of all the ceremonies. So there's no real secret there. But when you look at the present, and then you say, if I look back at 1930s, 1940s, what was happening? right? It doesn't make sense that this all came from nowhere. That was my basic contention. And finally, this is a very hard subject to study because it was a taboo. For many decades, it was a taboo to investigate this subject. And we see, for example, in the 1930s and 40s, there are a lot of court cases of people who are being tried for doing secret ceremonies. And oftentimes their defense is to say, well, yes, but in the Constitution, it says there's religious freedom. So this law contradicts religious freedom. So we see many challenges to the law over the period. And in the 1961 Constitution, it says you cannot challenge the constitutionality of this law. So it cannot be undermined, right, despite whatever evidence you might find. And so people have stayed away from this. They've stayed far away from this. Finally, we have the issue of sources. The state archival sources on these subjects have not been available for the most part until very recently, until the last 5 years or so. In 2024 and 2025, there were large files that were opened finally to the public, and people are just now reading them and writing about them. So it's a very exciting moment to be looking at this topic. But as I said before, it's hard to understand also because the lives of the sheikhs are a different story from the tekkes, the buildings, the traditions that they used to practice, et cetera, et cetera. So we can get into some of those topics if you wish, but I think that's a good start.
Okay, first of all, you very distinctly mentioned that about the three pillars of Islam in Turkish society, and basically, I see that we are witnessing homogenization period of Islam in the last 200 years of history, because maybe we can start this process by early 19th century, the persecution of Bektashi's by the closing of Yeniçeris, and other than that, in maybe Hamid's time, we have some sort of religious council and the establishment of Diyanet. This continues, and we are witnessing a homogenization, and maybe we are seeing some sort of limiting Islam in mosques sort of thing is happening there, and the place of mosques is getting bigger in Islam as a result of it. But as an historian, you wrote about what did those people do? What did they change? What did they become? Because as you said before, those people are mainly the most educated part of Turkish society. And by chance, in the last summer, I have come up with the direct descendant of Mevlana in Turkey, and her name is Yasemin Çelebi, and she made some research about Mevlevi sheikhs and their descendants, and most of them are staunch secularists now, and most of them are very proud Kemalists who are really supporting these kind of reforms, and they don't even question what did they have, who they limit or anything like that. They just support everything that happened in the early Republican history. Even they don't have any questions about it, and the state did do the right thing. They just say that, as she said something like that, and they just become the allies of the republic. They choose to not to resist and became an ally of this period. And basically there is a chart in your article that attract a lot of attention, I guess. Maybe we can see that chart by the help of our dear editor Recep. You can show it also. This chart actually attracts a lot of attention to your article because it is very specific and it is very striking. Can you explain it to us?
Sure. What we did was I, together with one of my students, Yusuf Salman Inanç, spent several years just collecting what Sufi sheikhs did after 1925 as an official job. Some of them held more than one job, where they changed jobs 1, 2, even 3 times. So what we did was categorize them according to the sector. And you see them here: mosques, local government, cultural fields, national government, education, and unofficial sheikhs. So cultural fields includes working in libraries, music ensembles, doing art or culture. Education includes all kinds of teaching, from the elementary school level to the high school to the university level. And then national government includes people who worked in the parliament, people who worked for ministries, especially the Ministry of Education, but also other ministries, some in the military and other possibilities. Local government, this refers to people who were more like clerks working at various bureaucratic jobs, not in the national ministries maybe, but in the various cities or provinces. And the mosques is, I think, probably maybe one of the most interesting ones because it's the largest category. It's partly surprising and partly not surprising, I think, because many people tend to think about Sufis and mosques as separate, but many Sufi lodges also had masjids or jamis attached to them. And so the ones that had mosques were allowed to stay open. The mosque could stay open, but you couldn't use the semahane or tefidhane or whatever. And so many of those figures simply stepped across the courtyard and continued being the head of the mosque. Yeah, there's many different things we can discuss here, but if we think about, say, the Young Turk period or the second constitutional period, there were a lot of manifestos written about reforming the Sufi lodges. And one of the most influential ones recommended that they all become teachers, that the Tekkes become schools and the sheikhs become teachers, the ones who are qualified for that. We see here, actually, it partly it partly happened, but it was actually a small percentage of the sheikhs that became actual teachers. There are some famous cases, especially in Istanbul and other places, of teaching sheikhs. But in the broad view, what the chart tries to show us is that, number one, very few Sufi sheikhs continued to practice widespread Sufi activities. So we see here 4.1%. It's the smallest category on the whole chart. So oftentimes people say, we read various histories of the period and they say, oh, they closed the tekkes, no big deal. They just did it in their apartment or in their house. That was true in some cases, but I don't think it was the majority, right? It seems to be a minority activity. Of course, there's some blurring between these categories, and that's something I think that people have noticed and that I also talk about in the article. There's overlap. So some people...
Brett,
Mhm.
Please.
Please.
Can you elaborate about these calls for reform? Because we know about these early Turkish, when we are talking about our early Turkish public history, these reforms, revolutions came to practice out of nowhere in our daily mundane historical knowledge, but every one of them has some backgrounds. And maybe we need this kind of understanding to really grasp the situation, because as you said before, there were thoughts about reforming Tekkes and reforming this kind of Sufi lodges. There were some calls to reform within the Islamic circles to do that, not in order to make a secularist case, but in order to make an maybe conservative case, maybe just reforming, not reforming, but maybe strengthening Islam, maybe some sort of a conservative approach. That same thing, maybe result is another thing, but the aim is something else. Can you talk about this kind of stuff?
Sure. I think the major turning point in this is the Balkan Wars, 1912, 1913. And it's a crisis moment in late Ottoman history in which people are questioning everything. And they say, how do we lose these wars? What's wrong with our schools, with our army? What's wrong with our religious institutions? And so people are really kind of calling for a whole reform of society, and we see a lot of manifestos. So yes, they go point by point, and one that we see frequently is the Sufi lodges. And some proposed reform, and the state did reform the lodges a lot in the second constitutional period, and also during World War I until the very end of the empire. There were ongoing centralization changes happening. They created quality control for the sheikhs, so they had to take tests to see if they were knowledgeable enough to be a sheikh. They had inspectors come and check out the hygienic situation of the tekkes to make sure everything was in order. And so there's increasing regulation. Now, so I think a lot of reforms happened, and then we have the Independence War. And in the Independence War, the Sufi lodges helped a lot. And for example, today I was looking at some really interesting images from SALT Araştırma, SALT Research Center in Istanbul. And you can see, for example, the Seyit Gazi complex near Eskişehir. It was bombed extensively by the Greeks, and the leaders of the lodge were taken prisoners by the Greek army, taken to the Aegean Islands, where they were held for quite some time. So in any case, after the Independence War, as the article mentions, many of these leaders of Sufi lodges were seen as allies. They helped, they contributed, the lodges were used for all kinds of different purposes in that period. So this is ongoing. And then you have the major reforms of the early republic, especially in 1924, when they target the religious institutions. So the caliphate is abolished, the madrasas are gone in 1925, but they didn't touch the Sufi lodges in 1924. And many people wonder why is that the case? And I think it's because they weren't seen as enemies in any sense, but that it was really there was only a change when the Sheikh Said rebellion happened, and it was kind of extended and blamed on the whole system of Sufi lodges. So yes, I mean, as you said, you can go back a couple of hundred years. There was a centralization process. There was more regulation over time, and there have been really very good studies of this, especially by Muharrem Varol. But this radical turn in 1925 is somewhat unexpected, and it's also for that reason that some of the Sufi sheikhs are shocked that this happened.
I also like to. I couldn't find. I guess I can find it. No, not this one. Sorry.
No worries.
His book is just close by, but I couldn't find Muharrem Varol's book. You said before, it is an excellent book about it, and you said quality control. Our audience is really, I'm pretty sure, witness that in Turkey in today, because when we are going to cemeteries, there are people who are praying to the souls of our deceased relatives, but our Diyanet administrators are continuously making quality control about this kind of people who are walking around our cemeteries to pray. Can they really pray or not? They are really checking that kind of quality control.
Yes.
Is still continuing in Turkey now, and that's still a subject. And our administration of religious affairs still strictly controls that issue. That's very that's a still continuing debate in Turkey. And you mentioned one critical thing, that these Sufi lodges are first seen as an ally, but after some critical turning points, you said Sheikh Said rebellion, and in your article there is another issue about Menemen uprising, I can say. There are two main turning points. Those two events actually work against Sufi lodges, and mainly Sufi lodges comply and respected government's authority. I can say that. What kind of results we get from these reforms? Did they really reach their goals, or did they create some sort of bubble or some sort of playing ground to another religious affiliations, or did they really encourage secularism in Turkey? Did they change the public sphere in Turkey, or can we say that our Turkish Islam is less, for example, urban, more rural today because of these reforms? I mean, these are bold claims. I see that as an academician, you don't really choose to be as bold as I am. But what is your interpretation of these reforms results?
It's a great question, and it's as you showed, it's a complicated one. If I use again the pillar metaphor, if you have three pillars and you take one away, and then you've got just two, you've lost a lot, right? And actually, you don't just take one away; you also take the madrasas away. So, as you said, there's just mosques left, Okay, I think the article gave the impression to some people that the 1925 law, was not. Well, I'm not gonna say this the right way, so I'm not gonna say it. I think they got the impression that it was too favorable to the early Republican reforms, right? I think it's a complicated issue. So, to answer your question, I think the overall effect of the law was quite destructive. And I'll say for this reason. First of all, with regard to the nature of the law, it says not only that the tekkes have to close, it says that even in private, you cannot do a ceremony that's affiliated with Sufis. In private, in your house, you cannot wear a hat or a robe that has to do with Sufis. And what this does is it gives the police and the state in general a huge problem to deal with. It's very difficult to police that kind of thing. So before 25, you had tekkes, you know where they are. The people meet there. If you want to watch them, you can send a police officer or a secret, observer, which was very common in the Hamidian period and probably also afterward. The Sufi sheikhs were people that you knew. They were from a similar social class. If you had a problem, you call them up and you say, let's talk about this. The state provided most of the funding for these places as well. So the state had quite a bit of control over these institutions. But once you pass this law and you say, no, it's illegal to do that and to have any ceremonies, then you have a really difficult situation. So people start gathering together secretly in coffee houses, in factories, in apartments, anywhere they can, in mosques, right? And it's very difficult for the state or for the police to know where they are, right? To know if it's a Sufi gathering or if it's just people singing songs together. And we see this in dozens and dozens and dozens of archival documents. It becomes very difficult for the police to know who the sheikh is. That's their main problem. They go and they stop a ceremony and they arrest some people and they say, who's the sheikh? And they say, it's some hoja in another village. And the police can't catch them. So they're unknown people. So they're chasing ghosts a lot of the time. So you've gone from a situation in which the state has a lot of control over a very limited number of people in exact places that you know, to a situation in which people are secretly doing things in all kinds of locations, which you don't know, people who you don't know, because oftentimes these are new sheikhs. These are people who popped up after 1925. There is a vacuum of religious authority after that point. And so we see many new religious leaders appear on the scene. I mean, one of the best examples would be Kemal Pilavoğlu. He's a very famous case, but he was not a Sufi sheikh before 1925. After 1925, he becomes the scariest example of irtija in Turkey for the early Republican state. And so I think the law actually made things much harder for the state to police. That's one part of it. But you also questioned kind of the nature of Islam in Turkey. And I think many people have suggested this, that once you kind of get rid of interesting ways to visit the tombs or the processions and parades of Sufi orders or the musical traditions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that these institutions produced, then what are you left with, right? You're left with a kind of much more narrow, much more, the right word is conservative or not, but a much more limited and specific Islam that is limited to the mosques, that's limited to what Diyanet approves. And a lot is lost, right? A lot of traditions are lost or at least neglected. A lot of material culture is lost. And by that, I mean architecture, I mean artwork, I mean, communities that existed around places to serve certain needs of people, like pilgrimage towns, etc. So there's been a huge, let's say, cultural loss that is being written about in different places, but is not often much acknowledged. So when I write in the article that the sheikhs, they were okay, they weren't like vastly persecuted in the way that we think they were, it doesn't mean that there wasn't a lot of hardship and destruction in other places, because I think that there was. And I think you're right. We're still kind of seeing the results of this law even today. So once you prohibit many of these orders, and the ones who obey the law tend to blend in and kind of disappear, but the ones who oppose the law, who gather secretly, who build up resources and followers over time, these are the ones who have become more powerful in recent decades and in the present, I would say.
Maybe moderate ones choose to obey the law, but the hardliners choose to not to obey the law and they become, in parentheses, irtica. Other than that, it become more tricky than that. And you mentioned Varro's book about religious institutions, and I, as far as I remember, in his book, he described the persecutions about Bektashi orders and a lot of other orders getting together to persecute Bektashi orders, and Bektashis chose to blend in other orders, and they are trying to find who are the Bektashis in their own ranks, and, and that become more tricky. And as far as I remember, and their wealth and their possessions are also questioned. That was an issue. And for example, in my personal experience, who were the great grandchild of Rumi, their house became their personal family house became surrounded inside a museum, because everything other than their house turned into a museum. They just live inside a museum. In the end, they gave up their house to the state to become a museum. Also, Museum of Mevlana Museum in Konya. There are some strange cases, sometimes funny, sometimes not that funny cases appeared in our history. It is very difficult to just summarize it in a couple of sentences. As you mentioned before, it is a very strange and particular case. Other than that, in your data, we are clearly seeing that Republic actually tries to maintain these people within its ranks, within its legitimate grounds, and somehow religious institutions turn into a cultural or educational institutions. They became, for example, not about religion but about literature, but about music, what about art, what about education, and they turn into a cultural sites. They turn into, as I said before, museums. They turn into libraries. They turn into educational institutions. How they described this transformation, and we are seeing some sort of new trends in Turkish. We are seeing some sort of new trends.
I think it actually goes back to the early republic,
Mhm.
when the state was very comfortable with Sufism as culture, right? So Sufism as poetry, Sufism as music, great, no problem there. The
Mhm.
only issue is with Sufism, like in actual ceremonies and practices and positions. So
Mm.
the cultural heritage of Sufism was celebrated even in the early republic. And we see this with, as you said, the Mevlana Museum. We see it later with the establishment of a mausoleum for Yunus Emre. We see it via the collection of all the Sufi songs and poetry as kind of folkloric books. And then in the 50s, 1950s, we have again, the performances of Sufi music publicly, and the performance of the Mevlevi Sema in public again, right? So this was acceptable for a really long time. And I think by doing this, the early republic kind of translated Sufi tradition into national culture and into modern Turkish culture. Now, I think that this was done in many cases by people who really cared a lot about Sufism. I mean, many Sufis themselves helped in this process. So Hasan Ali Yücel is a very famous case. You can think about all the musicians like the Eguner family and the Ney and the radio, Turkish radio. So many Sufi artists and musicians and scholars produced this type of Sufism as culture in the 40s, 50s, 60s, etc. And so what you're describing, I think, is a combination of two things. One, it's this combined momentum of Sufism as national culture. And two, it's maybe a bit of this new age, international new age trends being adapted in Turkey. So these kind of trends have been existing in the United States and Europe and South America for a long time. People who do, I don't know, meditation and Mevlevi whirling, and otherwise they're surfing or I don't know, whatever they want to do. So I think that these kind of new combinations, they only make sense in a context in which, let's say, the reality of those Sufi orders no longer exists. And so you said Mevlevi, and I think it's a great case because, of course, the Turkish Ministry of Tourism and Culture officially funds the Mevlevi ceremonies and the troops, and they have promoted them for decades to go around the world popularizing these traditions. So when we see these cases in modern Istanbul, I think it's really kind of a logical conclusion of a long process, and it's also indicative of the state of the chaos of authority in modern Mevlevi world. So you have a famous musician like Kutsi Erguner who says that Sufi order disappeared in 1925. Anyone who says they're a Mevlevi is basically, talking nonsense. Then you have others, some descendants, some others who say, no, we're Mevlevis and we're still practicing. So we have these interesting conflicts, and these occur because of the law, really. If this law hadn't happened, we wouldn't have this situation, but it persists. So.
It is very problematic and it will stay problematic, but in the end we see the issue is not black and white, and we see this issue is not just came from outside, because in your article we see that there are debates about reforming Sufi institutions, not in order to erase them, but in order to modernize them, in order to reform them, in order to change them, because there are a lot of questions. People are questioning these orders at the time of Ottoman Empire also. And other than that, in your article you mentioned about what those people changed, what those people became. There are some, I know from the book of Ruth Miller, from Fıkıh to Faşizm, I don't know, Fıkıhtan Faşizme diye bir kitap var. Onun İngilizcesi neydi? Ruth Miller's book. And that book, there were a chart which is similar to your chart, and about the madrasa teachers who most of them turned to government jobs, and just a couple of them actually oppose reforms of early Turkish Republic. So you just make this case stronger to me. And it's very important to understand this transformation, and this transformation happened within its habitat, and this habitat is not just created from people outside of this debate. People who are making those reforms were still there at the time of the second constitution period, so that people who were part of those debates actually made that reforms. So your article made that very clear. In the end, in Turkey, history is not just history. When we are talking about history, we are talking about in today's politics. When we are talking, we just not study history. We devour history. We consume history. we are we like history not as a subject of debate, as a subject of existence or something like that. So. So that, what is your perception? What is your final saying about these reactions to your article in the end? I would like to know that also.
Sure. Well, in the main, it was great to see people actually reading an academic article, first of all, and secondly, really engaging some of the arguments. And I haven't gotten any hate mail yet. Maybe it'll come after this interview. We'll see. And I felt like most people who read it, even if they didn't agree with me, it made them reconsider some ideas. It made them put their own ideas maybe in perspective, and that was the goal. I really wanted to start to kind of force people to question the closing of the Tekkes, and I think this is one piece of it, right? The sheikhs' lives are one piece of it, but it's a very important piece because the persecution narrative is mostly about people, and people who are held up as martyrs oftentimes or disaffected. And there are people who really were persecuted, and I think we shouldn't forget that. But if we look at the broader scope of things, it makes sense that in the main, many Sufi sheikhs contributed to building the Turkish Republic and to building Turkish national culture. And we shouldn't see Sufi sheikhs as enemies of the Republic in the early period. We shouldn't see them just as bearded hojas with very conservative outlook. Not at all. Many of them were highly educated people who went to Galatasaray or other elite institutions in Turkey. And so I hope that this article is the beginning of a change of perception of this period and these people, and that instead of being villains in the history, they will also appear as major contributors to building the Turkish Republic as a new nation state.
It is very important, as you emphasize, because on one hand, they are actually participating these reforms. They are making these reforms actually viable or reasonable. Actually, they don't make it harder. They just want to participate. As I said before, my friend, who is just direct descendant of Mevlana Rumi, and people who she talked with are really staunch supporters of Turkish Republic. Most of them became the supporters of these kind of reforms, basically republic. And other than that, yes, early Turkish Republic is not a real democracy, but we cannot really call it just an anti-Islamic, anti-religious, not something like full force totalitarian. Yes, they are strict. Yes, they are somehow authoritarian tendencies that they are there, but we cannot really say something like they are staunch anti-clerical, like after maybe French Revolution or maybe Soviet Revolution. It's not there. When we read your article, we can really put our early Turkish Republic in its own place, its own exact place. It's not that kind of radical state that who are persecuting everybody and everywhere and this kind of. So yes, there are persecutions, but there are also some concessions. There are some middle grounds there. We can see it in your article, I suppose.
Well, thank you. That's very generous of you to say. I hope it makes a contribution. And I think I cite Yasmin Chalabi's thesis in the article.
Yeah.
Pachacuoğlu, right? Yes,
Yeah,
I do.
yeah, yeah.
Right. Okay, I've never met her, but I would be curious to chat with her sometime. Yes, I mean, there's a lot to be done, and
Mhm.
as I said, there were probably around 800 or so sheikhs at the time, and we only found 121 biographies of the careers after 25. So there's still more to do, but it's been very, very interesting to see how intense the response was to this article. I think you're right. It shows how important history is in Turkey. And for that reason, it's very exciting to write about Turkish history because there's an audience and there's a lot of passion, a lot of interest in these subjects. This wouldn't happen on a historical topic in Austria. I can tell you that much, where I live.
I can see that.
Yes, yes.
Uh,
So it's for a person like myself, it's a delight to kind of do this kind of research, and I look forward to exploring this more. I'm working on a book, which hopefully will be published soon, and it will go deeper into this topic, and we'll also look at what happened to the dervishes, what happened to the buildings, the tekkes, the foundations, the vakıflar, and these types of things, so that we'll get a fuller picture of what happened.
Thank you, Brett. Maybe we can just finish about your article, and I want to ask you something about your university, because maybe some of our viewers know that Central European University is a very critical university about a very particular person, which is Viktor Orban. We know that your university and Orban has a very difficult history. Can you shortly explain this history, and can you say something about this last election results in Hungary?
I can say a little bit. So I lived in Hungary, in Budapest, between 2014 and 2020, and Orban was elected in 2014, his last term. So we witnessed a big transformation in the country during that period. And it was basically a transformation in which the government took over institutions systematically, not just universities, but also media, radio stations, you name it. And in 2017, the Fidesz government passed a law that made it impossible for our university to continue operating in Budapest. Basically, we couldn't take any more students to study at our university. So the university mounted a big protest. We had 80,000 people marching in the streets of Budapest. We had numerous rallies. Orhan Pamuk came to CEU and spoke in support of our university. So a lot of drama in 2017-18. Unfortunately, the university had to leave the country because our board of trustees realized that if we stay, we're going to just disappear. And that's why the university moved to Austria in 2020. And I've been teaching and researching here since that time. So yes, Viktor Orban is not our favorite politician in European politics. And we had a fantastic campus in Budapest, which we left and which is still there in a kind of limbo state. And now that the election has happened, we're starting to wonder what's going to happen next for us as well. There's a lot of question marks about what the new government in Hungary will do. We don't know that much about them yet. So as your viewers and listeners might know, Peter Magyar used to be a part of Fidesz and was very close to the party. So now he's split, but how much has he split and how different are his views? There's a lot to learn. So I would say, though, that it's a very hopeful moment, not only for our university, but for the EU, because Hungary became a place where, if you want to do something you cannot do in the rest of the EU, you can do it in Hungary. And this was a lot of criminality. This was a lot of things that are not good for a democratic society. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, Ilkan, but if you ask any more, I'm happy to elaborate on anything. But there's a lot of reforms to be done now in Hungary, especially in the educational sector, in which
maybe to our audience, we can say that your university's position will be an indicator to new government's policies when we are looking outside. If they accept your return to Hungary, they are just passing a threshold. My point of view is that because a lot of my friends actually study there in Budapest, in Central European University, and they are actually fantastic people. I know about, for example, Yektan Türk, and I know about I had Beren, or a lot of people from Turkey actually went to Budapest and went to have a great time in Budapest, both academically and personally. It's a tragic loss for everybody that you forced to live there. I hope we will see a substantial transformation in Hungary, and I hope we will see some substantial change in the policies in Hungary. And this last election results are, as the last elections in Hungary is very, in Turkey, we really focused on the elections, on last elections in Hungary, because we are in Turkey in some sort of similar situation, because we really started to lose our trust to elections. When we are seeing something change through elections, it gives us hope, because as you mentioned before, 16 years of continuous Orban's rule is somehow letting people down. But in the end, there are some hope. There is some hope always somewhere. We have some hope. That's a nice thing to cling on, I think. Thank you. Maybe you can say something about your article. Maybe you can say something about what happened in Hungary. What is your thoughts on Orban? Maybe you can say anything before we finished. Can you add something? Do you want to add something about?
Well, I'm hopeful for reform in my own country, which is the United States of America, because that's the force that once that goes off, then so many different places are affected in this way. There's no coherence there right now, and it's very very sad to watch here from abroad, and also to see. I mean, it affected us a lot in Hungary as well, because during the previous administration, we had no problems with the Hungarian government, but when Trump took over, the protection or support, let's say, just vanished, and things changed very fast. So, yes, I mean, let's hope for very positive, democratic, hopeful transformations everywhere.
Brett, thank you for your participation and thank you for your kind words. We are actually try to dive into your article and try to dive into these deep subjects, but we cannot really get into the end of it for sure. But maybe we will find another time, another place to finish what we started. We are really looking forward to your book. When your book will be published, we will see you again. We want to see you again. Maybe we will make an interview in Turkish. You can. I hope that we can do it.
Well, if I can spend a couple weeks in Turkey and get everything back up to speed, it would be my delight.
I mean, it is same for me. It is same for me. I mean, when you don't talk, your English become rusty and rusty. You just need to some polishing. Just like
Absolutely, absolutely. So it would be my pleasure to speak with you again about such topics, and I really appreciate you inviting me to be on the show. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
It's a great privilege to take you as our guest today, Brett Wilson. We talk about your article. Thank you for your contribution. Thank you for today.
My pleasure. Thank you.